The man sits alone in a small Arkansas living room in the early 1960s. The house is clean, but worn a farmhouse that has outlived hard
We are ready
winters
for
and
the
good
attack.
harvests both.
Are you certain?
On the mantel
Have
above
to
a
be.
brick fireplace sits a single brass shell casing from a 75 millimeter round. Time has dulled the metal, but the casing has been polished bright, as if someone has been quietly arguing with rust for years. The man is not young. His hair has thinned to silver, and his shoulders have settled forward with age, but his hands still move with careful precision as he lifts the spent shell and wipes an invisible trace of dust from its surface. He holds it not like a trophy, but like something he never quite believes is real. "This shell should not exist," he says softly, "and if it should not exist, then neither should I." No one answers. The house is quiet. Outside, wind brushes against bare branches, and an old screen door creaks in the distance. He sets the casing back on the mantel, straightens it with 2 fingers, and steps away. For a brief moment, his reflection appears in the glass of a framed family photograph beside the shell. Then the image fades and the story slips backward in time to a different winter, on a different continent, in a forest where very few things survived long enough to grow old. It is November 1944. The Hürtgen woods crouch along the German border like a wounded animal that still has teeth. The trees rise tall and stark, their upper branches stripped by months of shell fire. A cold mist hangs low between the trunks, turning distance into a gray wall. Somewhere far off, artillery thuds in a slow, irregular rhythm. Closer in the forest crackles and pops as splintered wood cools in the damp air. Near the edge of a churned-up field, a Sherman tank sits almost invisible behind the broken spine of a collapsed stone wall. Mud cakes its tracks, and the white star on its hull is smeared with grime. The most unusual thing about it is not the scars on its armor, but the direction of its gun. The hull of the Sherman faces away from the narrow path that snakes through the trees. The turret, however, has been turned a full 180 degrees so that the 75 millimeter barrel reaches back across the rear deck, aimed straight into the fog that covers the approach. It looks wrong, like a photograph that someone has pinned up upside down. Inside the turret, a young gunner named Eli Mercer leans into the cold metal of the sight. His breath clouds the glass. His gloved left hand rests lightly on the elevation wheel. His right hand hovers near the firing trigger. His face is pale, but steady eyes fixed on the nothingness ahead. He should be terrified. Every story that circulates through American units says the same thing about this forest. Tanks burn here, men vanish here. You do not fight the Hürtgen, you survive it if the woods allow you. Yet Eli's voice when he speaks is level, range clear, no movement yet. Outside, the fog stirs. Faint shapes begin to form where the path bends. Not men, not trucks. Dark, heavy outlines moving one after another with slow confidence. 3 of them. Panthers. German heavy armor built to kill tanks like his at distances where the Sherman's gun might as well be throwing stones. The question hangs in the air, spoken by no one, but obvious to anyone who has ever read an armored warfare manual. Why is this tank facing the wrong way? Why is its hull turned from the threat while its turret stares down the path like a rifle aimed from the shadows? To answer that, the story has to step back a few weeks to a quieter day that was still full of danger. Eli Mercer grew up in Boone County, Arkansas, on a farm that could not afford to waste anything. His father kept an aging tractor alive with baling wire spare parts and stubbornness. Eli learned early that machines did not care about excuses. A belt either lined up correctly or it slipped. A gear either meshed cleanly or it stripped itself to pieces. If you misjudged a measurement, the metal would teach you the lesson without mercy. His mother taught school in town. In her classroom, numbers were not just answers on a chalkboard. They were promises. 2 plus 2 was always 4. If a student wrote 3, she did not call it almost right. She called it wrong, and she made him work it out again until the pattern made sense. Precision in her view was not about being clever. It was about being honest. By the time Eli turned 19, he was not the biggest boy in the county and not the loudest. He preferred to listen rather than talk. He could fix nearly anything that had gears or pressure valves. He rarely spoke up unless he had already done the math in his head. When news of Pearl Harbor rolled across the country, plenty of men talked about what ought to be done. Eli did not say much. A week later, he stepped into a recruiting office and signed his name. The Army discovered quickly that he was not a natural fit for the infantry. On the rifle range, his shots were accurate, but his instructors complained that he took too long. He liked to breathe check wind, feel the trigger. That extra heartbeat of caution looked like hesitation to men who wanted snapshots and aggression. In the armored corps, he was something else. Tank guns required calm hands and a mind that could turn distance into numbers on the fly. The instructors at Fort Knox saw the way his eyes measured the range to a target without conscious thought, and how his fingers adjusted elevation almost before the order was fully spoken. They put him behind the sight of an M4 Sherman and discovered that when he fired, he rarely missed. Training also taught him something that would become a friction point for the rest of his military life. Doctrine, he was told, existed because men had died to prove it. Tanks faced the threat, stayed mobile close with the enemy, and used speed and numbers to win. Hesitation killed. Questioning doctrine was not encouraged. Once during a live fire exercise, an instructor shouted at him when he paused an extra second before firing, "If you hesitate, you die." Eli did not answer aloud, but a different reply settled in his thoughts. "If I fire wrong, somebody else dies." That quiet disagreement between speed and certainty followed him across the ocean. By the autumn of 1944, Eli rode as the gunner of a Sherman the crew had nicknamed Cinder Fox. The tank belonged to Company B of the 312th Tank Battalion. The commander Staff Sergeant Hank Doyle was from Chicago and believed firmly that the best way to live through a battle was to hit the enemy first and keep hitting until there was nothing left that could shoot back. The loader Luis Ortega from Texas told jokes so often that no one could tell exactly where the nervous laughter ended and real fear began. The driver, Corporal Ben Harlow, measured life in feet of visibility and inches of armor. Eli, sitting low in the turret, was the quiet one who spent his evenings sharpening pencils and sketching out rough maps of the ground they had crossed that day. Where others saw trees and muddy tracks, he saw angles and firing lines. When the battalion rolled into the Hürtgen woods, the forest felt wrong from the first hour. The roads were narrow scars carved between steep banks, shell craters filled with brown water, wire and mines hid beneath blankets of dead leaves. German artillery had the paths measured down to the meter. Every bend in the road looked like a question, with only two possible answers: ambush or not yet. Shermans did not belong here. The tank's height, which could be useful in open country, became a liability among the trees. The 75-millimeter gun struggled to hurt Panthers from the front at long range. The German tanks with thicker armor and sharper teeth hunted in terrain that favored them from every angle. On their third day, Cinder Fox learned exactly what that meant. Another Sherman from their platoon rolled ahead around a bend in the forest track. The morning was quiet except for distant artillery. There was a brief flash of orange light beyond the curve, then a roar that seemed to tear the air itself. When Cinder Fox eased forward, the crew saw what had happened. The front half of the other Sherman was a burned wreck. The turret lay upside down in the ditch, blackened and twisted. There was nothing to rescue, nothing to fix, only pieces. Luis Ortega, usually quick with some remarks, said nothing for a long time. Doyle stared at the wreck until his jaw clenched tight. Ben kept glancing at the tree line, as if expecting another blast from nowhere. Eli looked at the shattered tank and felt something very cold settle in his chest. Same armor as ours, he thought. Same manuals. Same kind of men inside. The only difference is where they were standing when the German gunner saw them. That night, back in a shallow bivouac scraped out behind a ruined farmhouse, Doyle smoked until his fingers smelled more of tobacco than oil. Ben slept with his boots on. Ortega tried to sleep and failed. Eli took out his notebook. He drew a simple line for the road, a mark for where the destroyed Sherman had been when it died, and a rough estimate of where the German gun must have been. Based on the angle of the hit and what little he had seen of the crater, he traced the path of the shell in his mind. It confirmed what his instincts already suggested. The Germans had seen their target first from a position that forced a frontal shot. That was the whole story. The rest was just fire and steel. What if we stopped letting them see us first, he thought. The next day, as they moved through another sector of the forest, Eli walked a short distance from camp during a lull in orders and stood at the edge of a ridge that overlooked a narrow crossing. Below him, a small track cut through brush and fallen logs. If a tank tried to move through that choke point, its armored flank would be exposed for only a brief moment as it turned. If a gun were already waiting aligned on that exact slice of space, there would be no need to swing the turret under fire. No delay, just a single well-judged shot. Back at Cinder Fox, Eli climbed into the turret and almost on impulse spun the traverse controls until the gun came around over the rear deck. The feeling was strange. Everything looked backward through the sight. The hull, if it moved, would go the opposite direction from where the gun pointed. But the more he studied the view, the more the idea made sense. Park the tank with its front plate facing away from the expected enemy approach. Tuck the hull into cover. Aim the turret where the enemy must appear. Fire the instant a vulnerable angle presents itself. Then drive forward out of the hide using the more heavily armored front to escape instead of trying to reverse blindly away under fire. Elegant, he thought. Simple, and completely wrong according to every instruction he had ever been given. He waited until morning to share it. Over thin coffee, while frost still clung to the tank's metal, Eli outlined the setup to Doyle, Ortega, and Ben. The reaction was immediate. "You want to shoot backwards," Ortega said, eyebrows raised. "Sit there showing them our tail and hope they are polite about it." "This is not hunting season in Arkansas," Doyle added. "This is tank work. We face front and we move." Ben did not raise his voice, but his concern was real. "If they spot us and our hull is pointed the wrong way, we will not have time to get out." Eli explained the range calculations, the angles, the brief moment of exposure when a side plate turned. He talked about the convoy that had been ripped apart when the Panther fired first. He tried to describe the feeling of choosing the ground rather than letting the ground choose them. "The manual says face forward," Doyle cut in. "The manual says keep moving. The manual says we use numbers and speed, not tricks. I am not gambling this crew on a drawing in your notebook." The discussion ended there. Officially, the idea did not leave him. A few days later, Doyle received orders to send Cinder Fox on a patrol through a series of small clearings. Before they rolled out, he spoke quietly to Eli in the shadow of the tank. "If you are so sure this might work, we try it. Once," he said. "Once. If it goes bad, the notebook is gone, and we never speak of it again." They picked a stand of pines near a clearing that opened onto a narrow path. Ben backed the tank into the trees until branches scraped the rear deck. The hull faced away from the path. The turret rotated to cover the gap. Eli settled into the sight. The world narrowed to a gray rectangle where anything might appear. Wind moved the lower branches. The forest hummed with distant sounds. After a long stretch of nothing, two German motorcycles slipped out of the mist riders, hunched low against the cold. They moved in a loose curve across his field of view, exactly where he expected any scouting force to pass. The crosshairs rested on the lead bike. His finger found the trigger. "I have the shot," he said quietly. Doyle's answer came after a heartbeat. "Do not take it. Not for this. Not unless it changes the war." The scouts rode on, unaware of how close they had come. Hours later, word reached the company that a supply convoy farther along that same route had been shelled. No one knew if the motorcycles had anything to do with it. Eli said nothing. The question lodged somewhere behind his ribs. Had he just saved his crew by holding fire, or had he allowed others to die by letting those riders disappear into the trees? The next day, the battalion gathered around a map spread on a makeshift table. The faces were tired, lined with grime, but the mood was more troubled than usual. Captain Joel Rankin ran a finger along a sector of the southern forest. "There is a panther out there," he said. "A single cat moving on its own. It hits a road or a supply point from long range and then vanishes. Artillery cannot pin it. Scouts cannot catch it. Every time someone thinks they have it cornered, it slips away. They are calling it the Phantom Cat. If it keeps roaming," he added, "we can forget about holding these trails. It will cut us to pieces without ever showing us its front plate." Eli watched silently as the officers argued about possible responses. Artillery grids, air support that might not arrive, patrol patterns that had already failed. None of it addressed the basic problem. The Panther was choosing the ground. It was deciding when and where to appear. Every time it did, it enjoyed the kind of clean first shot that had destroyed the Sherman at the bend. Rankin's eyes shifted toward Eli. "You still believe in that backwards setup of yours, Mercer?" Eli did not answer at once. He pictured the saddle crossing. He had scouted the way the side armor turned the feel of the traverse wheel under his hand. "I know it works," once he said. We only need once. Rankin exhaled through his nose a long, tired sound. Then you get your chance, he said. Cinder Fox takes the assignment. That Panther dies or we do. There will not be time to argue with doctrine out there. The following morning, Cinder Fox rolled off the main track and into a shallow bowl half hidden by brush. Ben eased the hull backward until the rear almost kissed a wall of earth. Ortega stacked rounds within easy reach. Doyle checked the radio one last time. The turret came around in a slow, deliberate arc until the barrel pointed out over the rear deck toward a narrow lane between trees where Rankin's map and Eli's instincts said the Phantom Cat would have to pass. Fog thickened as the hours crawled by. The forest sounds faded into a kind of muffled hush. Eli's world shrank again to the rim of his sight and the faint motion of gray against gray. Then he heard it. Not large at first, just a suggestion of something heavy moving under strain. The sound grew into the deep mechanical growl of a powerful engine. A shadow appeared in the fog, long barrel first, then the low, flat turret of a Panther. It moved exactly where he expected, pushing cautiously along the lane, hunting for targets that did not yet know it was there. I have him, Eli said. Ortega's breath caught. Ben's hands tightened on the controls. Doyle's voice dropped to a single word. Fire! Eli squeezed the trigger. The 75mm gun slammed back, filling the turret with smoke and sound. The shell crossed the short distance like an invisible verdict. The Panther's side erupted in flame. Black smoke poured upward, tearing a wound in the mist. A figure struggled up through the commander's hatch and tumbled out, trailing fire. Another shape tried to follow and vanished in the smoke. For a moment, the Hürtgen itself seemed to pause. We just sniped a Panther with a tank facing the wrong way, Ortega said, voice shaking between wild laughter and shock. Doyle grabbed the radio handset. Command, this is Cinder Fox, he said. Be advised, Mercer's backwards setup just took out the Phantom Cat. Repeat, target destroyed. Static crackled, followed by clipped acknowledgments, disbelieving questions, and the usual swirl of half-formed orders. But nothing could change the fact of what had just happened. A Sherman, using a method no manual had ever described, had killed a roaming Panther from ambush and lived to tell the story. Later, as the smoke cleared and the tank withdrew from its hide, no ceremony waited for Eli Mercer. No reporter arrived to ask about angles and range. The official report would eventually describe the action with careful generic phrases. Unorthodox positioning, effective use of terrain, enemy tank destroyed with minimal risk to own forces. What the paperwork would not record was the moment when a farm boy from Arkansas decided that if the battlefield was going to kill him anyway, it might as well do it while he was trying to think his way out of the trap. Back in the Arkansas living room many years later, the old man watches the fire in his hearth. The brass casing on the mantel catches just enough light to shine. This shell should not exist, he repeats in his memory. And if it does, then every life that came after it is borrowed time. The forest of the Hürtgen has faded into history books and photographs, but the question that started there has not. What happens when one man in a steel box refuses to accept the only way he has been taught to point his gun? The answer does not come all at once. It arrives in whispers and rumors and other crews asking careful questions as smoke curls from their cigarettes in the cold. And that, whether the official records like it or not, is where the first domino falls. The rumor did not travel on paper. It moved through the Hürtgen woods the way sound carries in a church, low, uncertain but impossible to ignore once heard. Crews whispered during refueling halts. Infantrymen mentioned it in passing, half believing, half disbelieving. Some said a Sherman had killed a Panther from the side. Others claimed the Panther had driven straight into an ambush. A few insisted the tank involved had been facing backward, but that part usually earned a skeptical laugh. Still, whenever Cinder Fox rolled into a clearing or parked beside another tank for resupply, men glanced at it with something between curiosity and caution, as if the machine itself had begun to collect stories. Eli did not invite the attention. He kept working. He cleaned the barrel, recalibrated the sight, checked the recoil buffers, and updated the sketches in his notebook by lantern light. Luis Ortega sat close by, his bandaged hand resting on his leg. Ben Harlow crawled under the tank with a wrench to check the bogey wheels. Staff Sergeant Doyle smoked in silence, watching the trees as if waiting for them to move. Late that night, Ortega finally broke the heavy quiet. You know they will not write this down the way it happened, he said. Eli did not look up from his notebook. Write what? They will say the Panther made a mistake. They will say the shot was luck. They will not say we were sitting backward like a mule staring over its tail. Eli traced an angle with his pencil. Let them say whatever they want. The ground knows what happened. The days that followed were a blur of mud smoke and metal. The battalion received orders to hold several logging roads where supplies trickled through under constant German pressure. The forest around these routes was a maze of shattered trees and shallow ravines. Movement was slow. Danger was everywhere. 2 mornings after the Phantom Cat fell, the battalion anticipated that German armor might try pushing along a narrow saddle road that dipped between 2 ridges. If they succeeded, they could turn the flank of an entire regiment. Doyle looked at the map and then at Eli. You think we can catch them again? If they come through here, Eli answered, they will have to turn. That gives us 1 moment. If we are already sighted on that angle, 1 is enough. Ortega gave a nervous chuckle. So we are doing the backwards thing again. This time Doyle did not argue. Back it in, he ordered. We play this your way. Ben reversed Cinder Fox into a hollow behind a mess of fallen logs. The tall trees masked their position, and the tank disappeared into the broken landscape as if it had been carved from the same wood and mud. The turret swung around until the barrel hovered over the engine deck once more. The wind howled across the forest. Snow drifted from the branches in sudden gusts. Eli positioned the crosshairs on the only gap in the trees, large enough for a tank to slip through. He steadied his breathing and waited. Minutes passed, then more. Then the low, heavy rumble of engines came crawling up the slope. Eli touched his cheek to the cold metal of the sight. The first shape pushed into view a Panzer IV, not a Panther, but still a threat. Behind it rolled a half-track filled with grenadiers. The Panzer turned and its side armor slid perfectly into the crosshair, like a puzzle piece locking into place. Now, Doyle said quietly. Eli fired. The round ripped into the Panzer's flank, detonating inside the hull. The turret twisted sideways in a burst of smoke and flame. The grenadiers in the half-track leaped out in panic, scattering through the snow. Ortega let out a small, victorious shout. That makes 2 for the Fox. Doyle didn't celebrate. Move, now. Ben gunned the engine and swung them toward a secondary hideout before enemy artillery could react. They slipped out of the way like a ghost. That night, other crews approached them with questions spoken in low tones. How did you pick the spot? How far was the shot? What were you aiming at? Did you really keep the hull turned away? Eli answered simply. We let the ground tell us where to fire. A gunner from another Sherman leaned against the hull. So you think like a sniper, he said. But in a 30-ton box, Eli shrugged. A tank cannot sneak, but it can wait. Not all officers were impressed. A few days later, a staff car rolled into the battalion area, its tires sinking into the deep muck. Major Charles Brenner stepped out uniform crisp despite the filth around him. His face stayed calm as he walked through the noise of repairs and shouted orders, but his eyes were cold. At the field tent, he listened to the report about the ambushes. His expression grew sharper when the words unorthodox turret positioning appeared. Tanks do not turn away from threats, Brenner said flatly. They face them. Holding a tank backward is an invitation to disaster. Captain Joel Rankin lifted a clipboard. With respect, sir, the results have kept crews alive. Brenner turned to Eli. Mercer correct. Eli stood stiffly. Yes, sir. How many Panthers have you destroyed, Private? 3, sir. Brenner nodded once. Respectable. But doctrine exists because men died to write it. Are you certain your creativity is worth the cost of ignoring that? Eli felt the weight of every eye in the tent. His instinct was to apologize to soften his answer, but the words came out before he could rethink them. With respect, sir, we did not act like cowards. We acted like men who did not want to burn. The silence that followed was thick. Even Rankin blinked. Brenner stared at Eli for a long moment, as if deciding what to do with him. Then he spoke through clenched teeth. Luck does not make a tactic, Private. Eli kept his voice level. Neither does pride, sir. It was the closest thing to an open challenge they would ever exchange. Afterward, Brenner moved on, but a line had been drawn through the heart of the battalion old doctrine, on one side adaptation on the other. More battles followed, and each one seemed to tighten the noose around them. By mid-December, the Germans shifted tactics. Panther crews began firing blind high-explosive rounds into likely hiding spots before advancing. Tanks that attempted reversed ambushes without understanding terrain were hit before firing a shot. 5 American vehicles died in a single week. Superstition crept in. Some crews whispered that Eli's trick only worked for him. Others said the ground itself favored Cinder Fox. Others thought he was cursed. Eli ignored it. He studied the ground more carefully, not less. He chose positions based on smaller angles and narrower windows. He spent long nights marking diagrams and adjusting sight settings until his hands cramped. But the war always demands a price, and it soon demanded more than calculations. Another Sherman from their Battalion Greyhound 2 had tried to mimic the reverse turret method after speaking briefly with Luis Ortega. Eager to replicate the success, the crew backed into a hollow near a crossroads one that appeared safe but left them no escape route. They did not see the fallen tree blocking the rear. They fired once. The muzzle flash revealed their exact position. A Panther fired back. The explosion was heard across the sector. On the radio, only static and a single scream answered. When Cinder Fox later passed the smoldering crater where Greyhound 2 had been, Eli looked at the ruin in silence. That night, he wrote the names of the dead in his notebook one by one without commentary. Ortega found him outside the tank. "You know that is not on you, right?" Eli did not look up. "They heard the idea from us. They thought it was as simple as turning the turret." Ortega shook his head. "They picked the wrong ground. That is all." The next briefing with Major Brenner was stormier than the last. He slammed a stick against the map. "This is what happens," he said, "when men decide doctrine is optional." Captain Rankin met him eye for eye, holding a new sheet of tallies. The reverse turret tactic had claimed multiple enemy vehicles with minimal losses. Standard frontal attacks had suffered far worse. Sir Rankin said respectfully, "This is no longer an experiment. It is data." Brenner's jaw worked as he studied the figures. He hated the conclusion, but the numbers were undeniable. After a long pause, he said, "In wooded terrain, and only under specific conditions, company commanders may authorize flexible turret orientation and hull positioning. No praise, no admission of being wrong, but a crack in the wall of doctrine nonetheless." That night, Eli wrote to his sister Lena. He did not mention tactics. He mentioned the smell of burning canvas and metal, the sight of a hatch opening, with no one able to climb out, and the cold truth that every shot he fired meant someone else's family waited for a letter that would never come. "I am trying to make fewer sons die," he wrote, "not more." The letter went into a mailbag that might or might not find its way across the ocean. Eli tucked it inside and listened to the forest sigh under the weight of snow and wind. Somewhere in those trees, German tanks were adjusting their own doctrine, preparing blind shots into shadows, searching for the one American crew that had embarrassed them. Somewhere else, other Sherman commanders were quietly turning their turrets, testing angles in the dark, questioning the rules they had been taught. The game had changed, not because of bigger guns or stronger armor, but because one man had asked a question no one else dared to speak aloud. What if we turn everything around? And that was only the beginning of the dominoes. Snow built deeper on the Hürtgen floor, muffling footsteps and swallowing entire vehicles in white silence. The forest became a graveyard of shapes, burnt trunks, overturned roots, shattered steel. Every new layer of snowfall hid old scars while creating new dangers. Engines strained under the weight. Men slept in their coats. Radios crackled with messages that grew shorter and more urgent. Cinder Fox survived longer than anyone expected. Its hull was etched with soot and shrapnel scars. The paint along the side had been burned away in streaks. One bogey wheel clicked every fourth rotation, a reminder of a near miss they chose not to repair, for fear of freezing the mechanism solid. Inside the cramped steel walls, Eli Mercer grew quieter. He was still precise, still methodical, still exact in the way he measured shots and terrain. But the battles were stacking inside him like weights. Each fight narrowed the margin of error, and his brain, sharp as ever, felt the strain of knowing that precision could not save every life. The Germans learned quickly. Panthers no longer rolled confidently through open gaps. They fired high explosive shells into dense brush before entering. They rotated turrets toward unexpected angles. Some Panther crews believed they were being stalked by a new American tank destroyer. One gunner, Carl Weber, wrote in his small diary that they were facing an enemy that had learned to think sideways. On the American side, stories multiplied. Some Sherman crews wanted to try the reverse turret tactic. Others feared it. A few misunderstood it entirely, believing it was nothing more than pointing the gun backwards and praying. Several tanks died because of those misunderstandings, though Eli never saw the bodies. One afternoon, Captain Rankin pulled Eli aside near a half-collapsed barn. Snow dripped in the slow, heavy drops off the eaves, landing on the old wooden planks with soft thuds. "I need to know," Rankin said. "Is it the tactic or the man?" Eli thought before answering. "It is the preparation, sir. The thinking. The ground is the weapon. The tank only fires the bullet." Rankin studied him for a long moment. "If you could rewrite doctrine, what would you change?" Eli exhaled a slow white cloud. "I would tell crews that the enemy knows our rules, and that we do not win by repeating them." Rankin nodded once, then walked away without another word. The next morning, Major Brenner arrived with a new operation plan. Snow clung to his boots, but not to his uniform. Somehow, he managed to keep it almost clean. He laid a map on the hood of a Jeep and traced a line with a gloved finger. "The Germans are preparing a counterattack along the Call Trail," he said. "If they break this route, the entire sector collapses." The plan was simple and brutal. 3 Shermans would hold the trailhead. Infantry would dig in along the trees. Artillery would fall back to new positions. Cinder Fox would guard the southern bend. Doyle crossed his arms. "Panthers, I assume." "Several," Brenner confirmed. "Supported by grenadiers." Rankin looked at Eli. "You see anything we can use?" Eli studied the contour lines. A collapsed stone wall lay near the bend, forming a shallow pocket that could hide most of the Sherman's hull. If they backed in, he could sight the trail bend, where Panthers would naturally expose their sides for a moment. "That wall," he said finally. "It gives us one chance." Brenner fixed him with a hard look. "And if you miss?" Eli answered without blinking. "Then we die." The snow thickened as they moved into position. It fell in heavy flakes that clung to the tank and muffled every sound. Ben eased Cinder Fox behind the stone wall until the hull merged with the broken rocks. The turret rotated the full 180 degrees again, pointing toward the incoming trail. Inside, the air turned warm from the engine heat, then cold again when Ben cut it to a low idle. Ortega loaded 2 high-velocity, armor-piercing rounds, arranging the next shells in order. Doyle tightened the straps of his helmet and checked the radio 3 times. Eli pressed his eye to the sight. The curve of the Call Trail lay ahead like the neck of a funnel. Snow drifted sideways in long sheets. The trail was empty. Then faintly the sound came, the deep, steady growl of engines, sinking like the heartbeat of a metal beast. "They are coming," Eli whispered. The first Panther appeared like a shadow rising from the earth. Snow dusted the top of its turret. Steam curled from its exhaust. Behind it, 2 more Panthers advanced in a tight, staggered line. Ortega's hand trembled slightly. "Ready." Doyle leaned in. "Wait for your angle." The lead Panther rolled over a buried stump, shifting its weight and turning slightly to compensate. That turn exposed its side armor for a single breath. Eli fired. The shell hit the drive sprocket and ripped it apart. Sparks flared under the Panther's hull. Smoke spilled from the crippled engine. Panther number 2 swung its turret toward the flash. "Incoming," Ben shouted. The high-explosive round struck the stone wall behind them. A storm of rock and metal fragments slammed against the Sherman. The tank lurched violently. Ortega cried out, blood streaked the side of his neck, but the wound was shallow. Eli forced himself back on the sight. His ears rang. His teeth buzzed. His heartbeat felt distant. The second Panther was repositioning, turret turning. Eli saw the seam at the turret ring thin armor. Even Panthers struggled to protect. He fired again. The shot hit with a thunderous crack. Fire blasted out of the seam, and the entire turret jerked upward before collapsing into smoke. The third Panther advanced carefully, angling its hull to hide as much of its side as possible. Its turret locked onto Cinder Fox. Too late for a third shot. Doyle shouted, "Drive now." Ben hammered the throttle. Cinder Fox lunged forward, tearing out from behind the crumbling wall just as the Panther fired. The German shell obliterated the stones where the Sherman had been. Ben hurtled the tank into a thin stand of trees and killed the engine. All 4 men listened. Only snowflakes tapped against the hull. The third Panther prowled the clearing turret sweeping. Then a single boom thundered from the opposite ridge. An American shell streaked through the snow and struck the Panther square in the flank. The German tank stuttered, twisted, and erupted in flame. Doyle snapped on the radio. "Identify," a voice crackled back. "Mace 1 here. You softened them. We finished them." "Hell of a shot, Fox." Eli exhaled slowly. His hands trembled, and for the first time he did not hide it. That night the battalion met inside the burnt skeleton of a barn. No celebration, only the shared awareness that they had survived something designed to kill them. Rankin stood beside Eli. "I am submitting your method for formal review. They may never put your name on it, but they cannot pretend it does not work." Brenner approached next, arms crossed. His words came grudgingly. "Your tactics saved lives today. That is all I will say." Eli nodded. Nothing more was needed. The snow kept falling. The forest kept screaming. The dominoes continued. Crews from the 77th Tank Battalion claimed they had knocked out a Jagdpanzer using the reverse turret approach. A reconnaissance officer took pages of notes on Eli's considerations for cover and sightlines. Even German diaries reported confusion about American tank behavior. But the Hürtgen was merciless. Cinder Fox survived an artillery barrage that obliterated an entire infantry company. Ortega stopped joking at all. Doyle slept with one hand gripping the radio handset. Ben became a man of fewer and fewer words. Eli endured each day with a calm exterior, but inside he felt something wearing thin. The smallest mistake could kill them. And one day as snow turned to dirty slush and the forest moaned under the weight of war, Eli realized that if he stayed any longer, there might not be anything left of him to send home. They continued to fight, but the breaking point was near. What happened next would determine who lived long enough to see the winter end, and who did not. The winter did not break in one day. It frayed. There were more missions. Some were small, some terrifying. Most were simply cold and exhausting. Cinder Fox backed into more hollows, watched more gaps, took more shots that felt less like heroics and more like bookkeeping in blood and steel. Each time Eli calculated angles, and each time he felt the math cutting a little deeper. Once a shell landed close enough to peel a strip of armor off the side of their hull, like the skin from an apple. Another time a tree shattered in front of them and buried the tank in branches and ice. They clawed their way free and kept moving because there was nothing else to do. The tally of dead rose. Some were men Eli knew by name. Others were just call signs he heard on the radio before the static swallowed them. After one especially close call, when a Panther's round punched into the dirt less than a yard in front of their bow and sprayed the tank with stones, Captain Rankin called Doyle and Eli into a ruined farmhouse that served as a command post. Rankin looked older. The lines around his eyes had deepened into something close to permanent. "I got orders from up the chain," he said quietly. "They want experienced crews rotated back for rest and training duties. We argued about who to pull. Command decided Cinder Fox has tempted fate enough." Doyle bristled. "We are still in the fight, sir. We can hold ground." Rankin shook his head. "You have done more than that, Sergeant. You have shown us a different way to fight. I need you alive to explain it later, not as names on a list." He turned to Eli. "That backwards business of yours has already spread farther than this battalion. Other units are sending observers. If you die here, they will keep the idea and forget the man. If you live, maybe you can put the truth on paper before everybody starts polishing it into legend." Eli stared at the map for a long moment. Part of him wanted to argue, to insist on staying, to prove that he was not asking for special treatment. Another part of him was simply tired, tired in the bones, tired behind the eyes. "What about the men who take our place?" he asked. Rankin's answer was blunt. "We all take someone's place here. The difference is what we leave them." In the end, Eli did not object. Cinder Fox was reassigned to a rear area for refit and later attached to a different unit. Another crew would drive her. Eli, Doyle, Ortega, and Ben were sent back from the front first to a training ground to describe what they had done then to different postings as the war ground on toward its end. The Hürtgen kept killing long after they left it. Months later, when the war in Europe finally ended and ships began taking men home instead of carrying them out, Eli found himself standing on an American platform duffel bag on his shoulder, the smell of coal smoke and hot metal all around. A girl with dark hair and braids pushed through the crowd and threw her arms around him. Lena. She was older than the photograph he kept taped inside the turret, but her hug felt like the only real thing in the world for a moment. His father waited behind her with an old wrench in his hand. "Figure the tractor has missed you," his father said, offering the tool like a handshake. His mother stood a few paces away, eyes shining, already counting plates in her head. They drove home along the same roads Eli had traveled as a boy, past the same fields and fences. The sky seemed too big after the low ceiling of the Hürtgen. The silence felt wrong without the distant thud of artillery underneath it. He did not talk much about the forest that first year. When people in town asked, he gave them sentences he could carry without dropping anything sharp. "It was cold," he would say. "It was loud. I was lucky." In a battered crate that arrived weeks after he did, wrapped in oilcloth, and paper, was a single spent brass casing from a 75mm round. Someone in the battalion had pulled it from a box marked with his tank's number and the date of the Phantom Cat engagement. There was no note. Eli turned the casing in his hands. He remembered the fog, the shadow of the panther, the feeling of the trigger under his finger. He remembered the man who had tried to climb out of the burning turret and hadn't made it. He cleaned the brass, polished it until it shone, and set it on the mantel above the farmhouse fireplace. Years passed. He fixed tractors and combines. He taught Lena how to double-clutch an old truck on the gravel road behind the barn. He married buried friends, watched the town change in small ways and stay the same in others. Occasionally, a neighbor or a visiting cousin would notice the shell casing. "That from over there," they would ask. Eli would nod. "From a bad forest with a worse winter." "Did you shoot at someone once?" pressed. He studied the brass, seeing again the panicked eyes of his loader, the tight jaw of his commander, the map lines under Captain Rankin's hand. "Yes," he said finally. "That one was mine." He rarely said more. Officially, the manuals that came after the war mentioned new ideas in careful, bloodless language: flexible turret orientation in restricted terrain, asymmetric hull positioning, emphasis on pre-selected firing lanes and ambush positions. The words never once included the name Eli Mercer. But in the places where veterans gathered in quiet corners of VFW halls and under the low ceilings of American basements, the story traveled differently. Tankers who had fought in the woods remembered a crew that backed in when everyone else drove forward. They remembered a gunner who treated a 30-ton machine like a rifle and the ground like a friend. Back in that small Arkansas living room in the early 1960s, the man with silver hair picks up the brass casing again. "This shell should not exist," he murmurs almost to himself. "And if it does, then so do I." He thinks of the crews who never came home, of Greyhound 2, of the hatch that never opened far enough. He thinks of the letter he wrote to Lena in the Hürtgen, the one that said he was trying to make fewer sons die, not more. He cannot measure whether he succeeded. War does not allow clear accounting. It only offers questions and the lives that hang on how men choose to answer them. On a cold morning in a foreign forest, Eli Mercer answered by turning his gun the wrong way on purpose. History remembers generals' campaigns and the flags planted on ruined cities. It rarely remembers the farm boy in a steel box who looked at the same ground as everyone else and asked quietly, "What happens if we turn everything around?" The manuals will not tell you his name. The shell on the mantle will.